today we're going to hear first from Dan and then from Natalia. And then we're going to have conversation between Dan, Colin, and Natalia. And then Colin will present a case study. Dan will talk about what is a social enterprise and what are the policy changes. And Natalia will talk about policy frameworks for social enterprises globally. So we have a great, there you are, Natalia, wonderful. Dan is going to talk about what is a social enterprise, and then Natalia about policy frameworks for SCs globally. We are very lucky to have you, Dan. Thank you. I think you're joining from the UK. Yes, he has a lot of experience on funding, financial, social enterprises, has worked for the UK Treasury and the Cabinet Office, where he led the development of government policy on social enterprise access to finance and the role of the voluntary and community sector in public service delivery. He has many other experiences which make your participation then really important and rich for us. So with that, I will pass on to you, and as you finish, I will then introduce Natalia.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Excellent, thank you. Hi folks, it's really good to be here. Thank you for the chance to meet you and to say a few things. I've lost the take control option on the share screen, so if I can do that somehow again, would that be possible?
Be able to see the button at the top that says take control.
It came up and then it's gone down again.
No, it's up now.
I got it now. Yeah, got it.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Great. Okay, brilliant. So everyone can see the slides. You can see my boy with his Social Enterprise UK football shirt on, soccer shirt, sorry. So yeah, hi folks, Dan Gregory from Social Enterprise UK. Social Enterprise UK is a national membership body. We have about 3,500 members across the UK who are social enterprises. They're very diverse. Some are very small, some very large, some sell coffee and chocolate, some recycle bikes or IT equipment, some run public services, some own community assets and heritage assets. They work in almost every sector of the economy, and I can say a bit more about who they are and what they do from the evidence that we gather over the next kind of 7 or 8 minutes or so. So I'm really pleased here to just tell you a little bit about our work and work around the world that we've been doing, and the lessons that we've picked up a little bit on what is social enterprise and how's it getting on, and what are the challenges and barriers that social enterprises face, and some of the evidence. Yeah, as always, I think wherever we've worked in about 25-30 countries around the world for the last 5 years or so, helping with research and policy, and inevitably, however much we have in common and however diverse we are, and different cultures and languages, in almost every country in the world, we always seem to start with the question of what is a social enterprise and how do you define it. So I'll start with that again today, and hopefully bring a little bit of, not a solution or a definitive answer, but a little bit of clarity to that debate. The first thing to say, I guess, there's just a bit of echo there. The first thing to say, I guess, is that there is no answer. In obviously, people have different languages, different conceptions of the term. There's ongoing debates about this, and actually, we tend to use in our work the notion of people self-identifying as a social enterprise. But around the world, from countries we've worked in as diverse as Brazil, Sudan, Indonesia, China, Kyrgyzstan, Greece. There's a number of, I guess, defining characteristics that help us understand social enterprise. So if we run surveys and ask social enterprises to respond, and then we ask them about how they define themselves, we start to pick up some common patterns. In the UK, the 4 that you can see on your screen, hopefully, are the 4 that we tend to use most of all to help us understand what a social enterprise is. So much like a restaurant, there's no legal definition that says this is a social enterprise, and unless you meet that, you're not one. It's more of a kind of understanding. So a bit like restaurant, we could argue, is McDonald's a restaurant? Is it not a restaurant? And people might have different views. Similarly here, we can have different views. There's not one single answer, but we tend to say that in the UK, social enterprises, number one, is quite clear. These are not public enterprises. They're not state-owned enterprises. They're independent of the state. That's probably the least controversial one. The second one is that the majority of their income is earned through trading. So they are enterprises, they're businesses, they're commercial. They sell goods and services services, they trade in markets, their income streams are generated through that commercial activity. Doesn't mean they can't get some grants. You know, all businesses sometimes get some grants, but generally they are differentiate themselves from traditional voluntary community organizations through their enterprising commercial activity. Thirdly, they have a commitment to a social purpose or environmental purpose, enshrined somewhere, kind of locked in. It can't be diluted, maybe through the legal form they adopt, maybe through the nature of their ownership, some other way. And this is a bit tricky in some countries where the legal frameworks don't exist, or it's difficult to lock in and prove that. So there's a little bit of flexibility there in many countries, I think. And finally, the most controversial really is around what happens to the profits. In the UK, Social Enterprise UK, for our membership, we say you have to reinvest the majority of the profits in that mission to be a social enterprise. In actual fact, 90+% of our membership reinvest all their profits in their mission. But there are some, maybe some co-ops that distribute profits to workers, maybe joint ventures, some where there's a sort of profit sharing, maybe not all of the profits. And that's where we get into debates and arguments. And you find different in countries around the world. So perhaps countries where Mohammed Yunus, sort of grandfather of microfinance, if you like, Mohammed Yunus's influence has been strong. He talks about non-dividend, so distributing no profits. In other countries, like in India particularly, they don't seem too bothered about what happens to profits. They say it's more about the mission and the impact, and don't worry about the profits. So there's not one answer. Maybe we get clearer over time through some of the work that we're doing, calls like this, but there's still a way to go before we all agree, I think, if we ever will. But you get a sense of who these enterprises are.
Dan, just one clarification. Is this a legal definition in the UK?
No, it's not in the UK. No, we do have consistency over about 15 years of government departments, 6, 7 government departments using pretty much the same words. We use the same words. Our other peers and colleagues use the same words, but it's not legally enshrined. Now, we do have legal forms, including one called the Community Interest Company, invented relatively recently, that social enterprises can adopt, but they don't only adopt that. Some will choose other forms. So companies limited by guarantee, companies limited by shares with certain structures, cooperative societies, charitable models. There's still a range of legal forms, but not one overarching legal definition of social enterprise. In some countries, they do have that. That brings pros and cons. So, for example, it brings clarity. However, you might find that you're not, we've got probably something like 60, 70, 80, maybe even 100,000 of these things in the UK. In order to bring total clarity, you'd need them all to join up and sign up to that, and some of them don't. So there's many trading charities, many cooperative societies that meet these tests. They don't even call themselves a social enterprise. They don't recognise themselves as social enterprise. They primarily identify as something else, maybe as a community business or a charity or something. So yeah, to tidy it up is difficult. And in many of the countries where they've introduced a kind of, here's our legal definition, and if you're not one of these, you can't be one, it actually hasn't worked that well. Only a few hundred have signed up. I think it's in Thailand, actually, where you're not allowed to call yourself a social enterprise unless you meet that test and you've registered. And lots of organisations in Thailand have cheated by, they don't call themselves social enterprise in Thai, they call it in English because that's not in the legislation. So they go around, sort of get around the, they found a loophole for that. So, it doesn't, there's been efforts to bring clarity, but no one anywhere has really ever successfully tidied this all up in one neat kind of box, if you like. But, I think we get clearer every year. Here's a good example of, I like to think of this territory, I think, as a kind of Venn diagram. That I think the easiest way to explain social enterprise to your mum is to talk about this spectrum where you've got kind of non-profits, charities, voluntary at one end, private business, profit seeking at the other, and social enterprise is kind of in the middle. And that's useful, I think, as a sort of beginner's explanation of what social enterprise is. It combines that commercial business mindset with the social purpose. But actually, I think we've got more of a Venn diagram. It's a bit messy than that. You've got, overlap between social enterprises and B Corps and co-ops and community business and other terms that people use. Inclusive business in Southeast Asia is used quite a lot. Mohammed Yunus talks about social business, slightly different, and obviously translating that in different languages has other complications. So actually it's a bit more of a Venn diagram, and you can see here maybe in the slides, there's characteristics about what you do with your profit. Do you have a purpose enshrined? Who's got the power? How do you behave as a business? And I think actually, social enterprises are things which meet certain tests that they are one. It doesn't mean that they all behave brilliantly in practice. We do have some not very well behaving social enterprises. Of course we do. Not everyone is perfect. So there's a mix there and different things to look for. And the ideal world is we all get to the middle of the Venn where, profits go towards benefit of society. the purpose is enshrined, the power is shared and distributed more equally, and they're all behaving, you know, as exemplars of business. But you know, again, it's a journey towards that, the heart of that Venn diagram, I think. Here's some figures. We worked with, of all people, the World Economic Forum recently. So the guys behind Davos on their mountaintop retreat in Switzerland that you can only get to in a kind of padded helicopter. But you know, there's some great people there that get social enterprise and understand that the sort of negative externalities of business create all sorts of problems in terms of environmental catastrophe, inequality, and they're very interested in social enterprise. So we did a research project about the scale of social enterprise around the world, and you can see some of the figures here. So we've worked, as I say, in a range of countries with local teams gathering some of this evidence. So please have a look at our reports on our website. British Council have been involved in this. They've got lots of evidence on this, and the guys at WEF as well. And you can see some of the figures. This is a not insignificant part of the global economy. It's, you know, in many countries, really, really significant and makes a huge difference to people's lives around the world. In the UK, we
need to wrap up to go to Natalia.
I'm nearly there. In the UK, we do research, and every couple of years we publish the sort of evidence on how these social enterprises are getting on. So not the numbers of how many, but the flavour. And you can see here, and please look at the research, how against that triple bottom line of environmental, social and economic, actually they're doing really well. They're thriving, they're innovating, they're growing, they're confident, they're led by more diverse teams working in tough areas, frequently led by women, really against the odds, if you like, thriving. Environment, maybe that's probably the area that, given the scale of the challenges we face, social enterprises could do even more, and we need to raise our game a little bit. But I think uniquely, because of their different ownership structures, they can do that. They're not beholden just to that profit motive, and they offer great potential for showing a different way of doing business. Finally, which I won't go into detail, but maybe we'll come back to in our discussion later, from our work around the world, we've gathered evidence and sort of aggregated research on the challenges that social enterprises face. So you can see some of these examples here. Generally, they seem to be thriving against the odds, but they don't always get the policy support or recognition. People don't always understand them. They don't fit into some sort of policy framework. Sometimes they struggle to access finance and funding because of their structures or because of the way that they're slightly different to conventional businesses, if you like. So a lot of our work around the world has been helping policymakers think this through and try and tweak that landscape and adjust it, and even sometimes to favour these businesses because people have come to believe that they are, you know, the future and a cause for hope in a world full of challenges. So at least a level playing field, but maybe more than that. Maybe sometimes policies that indeed favour these social enterprises and give them a chance to contribute even more to our common futures. So yeah, I will.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan. Lots and lots of food for discussion when we go to the panel. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Natalia Agapitova. Natalia, thank you so much for being with us. Natalia has a PhD in economics on the role of innovation and private sector for inclusive and sustainable development. I should call you Dr. Agapitova from now on, Natalia. Her current work, she works in the World Bank as a senior economist, in the finance, competitiveness and innovation practice. She has always been in that space of innovation. She covers today around 2 billion in the lending portfolio, focusing on private sector development in Burundi, DRC, and regional initiatives related to entrepreneurship. And I have been inspired by the work that Natalia has done on looking at different ecosystems around the world, on enterprises, including the legal aspects, but in general, looking what does it take to support social entrepreneurs around the world. So with that, over to you, Natalia.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind words and all the collaboration we had over the years. I think much of what I'm presenting is also due to the Imago contributions and a lot of work we've done together on the ground. So the appreciation is very much shared. I would like, so it's very useful to build on the previous points, and I think we share much of the kind of basic premise of the importance and uses for social enterprises. I think my my experience working with the governments on the ground is very interesting from the standpoint that I moved between different regions and between different countries at different levels of development. And when we work with countries that have a relatively strong government sector and very strong expectation for service delivery from the government, so kind of the social safety nets and the education as a constitutional right, or health as a constitutional right, or government provided services, there is a more difficult dialogue on what social enterprises will bring, because you need to differentiate them from the private sector and from the government, and kind of carve the space for them and go through all of these explanations that were discussed already. But when I shifted to Africa and I started working with governments in DRC, in Burundi, in Nigeria, you go to the government and you explain that those businesses can do this for the people, and they're like, great, we can't do it, we are failing institutions. If those enterprises can do the job and improve the development outcomes, we're all for it. And so I actually, I was often coming to the governments in those contexts with a long speech prepared on how you need to support the development of social enterprises. And they're like, nope, we're already convinced, let's do it. And that's where kind of it's important to understand that there are all of this positive effect, getting to marginalized group, better respond to customer needs and innovate, bring better value for money, because you build an efficiency by managing certain things by the private sector and based on business models. But there is also a range of public sector context and conditions to which the message of what is the value of social enterprises need to be adjusted. And let's say in countries like Tunisia, we had a long dialogue about who they are, the definition, how to specifically define them. In Burundi, they're like, any enterprise that works here is a social enterprise because our country is so poor, they're dealing with poverty challenges. Great, let's go ahead. I think another lesson for me is that, so we have kind of a relatively broad framework of what are the difficulties that the social enterprises face, and there is a big growth constraints. I think what we see from the global scale is that social enterprises emerge more and more, and we see them in many countries, and independent on the kind of where they are on the revenue scale, and kind of whether they're low-income countries or higher-income countries, the social entrepreneurship is on the rise, but the potential for scaling up is difficult, and we see kind of persistent challenges around this 4 areas. Access to capital by nature of the business model is difficult. Revenues are volatile because they reach the lower income populations. The legal and regulatory barriers, because there are often barriers to businesses already, but then on top of it, for social enterprises, there are additional very specific barriers that exist. And then the reduced capacity, because you do need to balance. I mean, you don't maximize the profits, you maximize the social goods or environmental goods, and that means that you need to function on a very tight budget, and it does create implications. And so the governments can play a role to improve those conditions. And the question is often I think in many countries where the business environment is already fairly weak, fixing the business environment is a key priority because it will help the whole private sector. In countries where the business environment is relatively sophisticated and there is a strong government support already, then very targeted interventions are very useful. And so we talked about, basically we developed a certain framework for scaling up opportunities and challenges, where you can build kind of the external conditions, the framework conditions on strengthening demand, building partnerships, and kind of sectoral growth overall, but then you can work directly with the enterprises as well to make sure that the funding kind of opportunities are there, that policies are supportive, and then the internal constraints like capacity are addressed. When we talk to the government often, so based on kind of this condition, often we, and I'm looking now at kind of more of the measures that target specifically the so we work through kind of strengthening the financial mechanisms, especially lately we're looking at those that don't distort markets, because often the problem is that if you subsidize certain activities, you incentivize private sector to move or disguise in a way for profit activities, and kind of in a way squeeze out the proper social enterprise out of the market and kind of benefit from the subsidies. And so what we found is that the option of paying for results actually gives the social enterprises all the flexibility they need to innovate, to not be constrained by very specific requirements by the government, and if the result is achieved is important. But often those result-based financing mechanisms need to be combined with some incentives for upfront investment, because often that is also what's lacking in the social enterprise sector. So kind of patient capital, impact investors, and so on. So we often the financial mechanisms, it's not like a one mechanism, it's often the whole financial infrastructure that supports socially oriented businesses. Regulatory measures, I think that's an interesting part where we more and more lean towards fixing the business environment is the key thing. And then interestingly, I think we're leaning more and more not to have or not to advocate very strongly for a legal definition of social enterprises, because it's such an innovative field that we are kind of behind the definition all the time. And legal definition, like for example, Italy has one, but many social enterprises operate outside of the legal definition that was adopted. So the key is to have an operational definition that can change with time and be flexibly adapted to necessary context. But the operational definition is very important, because that allows us to do the targeting of the social enterprise sector. And then capacity development. Yeah, I'm wrapping up. And then obviously the capacity development is extremely important. I will not go into details, just saying, so outcome funding that I mentioned, we work a lot with outcome funding schemes that have proven fairly effective, and more also with social procurement. And I will stop with that thought, because I think social procurement, the government and development budget is huge, and I think we don't use it enough to boost the social enterprise sector. And what we're trying to do now is to make sure that the approach to social entrepreneurship is integrated within the design of the World Bank development operations, not only those that target them as beneficiaries, but those that use the procurement processes to engage social enterprises as partner in development and in implementation. And I think for us, that will open up quite a lot of potential financing and collaboration with the social enterprises. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, that is huge, opening up the procurement to social enterprises and adapting to their needs. So now we're going to have a conversation, but first I want to introduce Colin, who is the co-chair of this social enterprise group within the community of practice. But Colin has had the most fun jobs that I've ever seen. You have. First, he worked as the country director for innovation for poverty action in Western Kenya. Then he was the directed government relations for Bridge International Academies, and then he is now the global policy director for One Acre Fund that is a social enterprise that reaches 4 million farmers. And now, as part of the policy director, Colin has really been thinking about the legal framework in the US for social enterprises, and so I want to start with that conversation among the three. So we heard Dan say there is no legal framework in the UK, but there are documents and forms. We heard Natalia said, the legal frameworks are not always used. And so I wanted to start with you, Colin. When you hear this, what do you think? Do you think we need a legal framework for social enterprises in the US?
Well, so yeah, first, so I actually don't know domestically in the US. Dan probably knows more than me about the domestic social enterprise policy, and that's a whole interesting conversation on its own. So I think I can speak more to how social enterprises fit into the sort of international development policy of the US.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll get to this in my short little case study at the end, but I agree totally with Dan and Natalia. I've really struggled in the early days of my policy work. I really focused on creating policy opportunities in US development for social enterprises with that term defined. And one of the reasons I think I struggled was that there is such lack of clarity on the term. And so I've had more success when I've talked about the getting priorities that social enterprises will be able to achieve or speak to well. So for example, outcome-based financing. So how do you create legislative opportunities that are more outcomes-based, right? Or more focused on sustainable scale. And yes, getting social enterprise, the term, into some pieces of legislation, but not getting lost in that, and really trying to figure out like what are the different ways we can do development globally that if we were to do it, social enterprises would be well placed to succeed. And I think, and I can, again, I'll talk more about it in my case study, but I think that's an important distinction because of everything that Dan and Natalia said. You just get lost in the definition, right? And you get so, it's like, that's not what we should care about, right? The point is there are many of these organizations doing great work. So, how do we think about different outcomes for, in my case, the US development agencies to basically, leverage all that great work that's already happening? And I don't think the definition is as important. At least that's my experience. You get lost in the definition.
I would love to hear from Dan and Natalia. I happen to think that it's really important. I think that if you're going to really scale the sector, if you really want the sector to take off, I believe that the social enterprise is the new development tool. It's a tool that will help governments reach the last mile because they're more nimble, because they're able to innovate, they're able to take risks and fail in a way governments cannot. And so I think just like PPPs were a new development tool 20 years ago, social enterprises are today. And so if you're really ambitious about it, you do need a legal framework, like you need a legal framework about small and medium enterprises. Why? Because then the governments can invest and have some filter for that. But that's my view, and I'm very open to be completely wrong. Dan, what do you think?
I'm not going to tell you whether you're right or wrong. I would say the problem is before what you've said. The problem is a lot of the discussion in this space is incredibly messy and confused. People are talking about different things. So you said legal framework, right? Now, you could say the words legal framework, and in many countries in the world, people would have a different interpretation of what you're arguing for, right? Let me talk about three possible things that you could be arguing for. One is you could be arguing for specific new legal forms for social enterprises to register as, to incorporate as. We have a community interest company model in the UK. There's others, Jamaica, looking at what, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Social co-ops in Italy. So a new form to incorporate. Right? That's what you could be arguing for. And in many countries we go, people say that we don't really fit with the charity, the NGO, we don't fit, we need a new legal form. Maybe you're arguing for that, right? Fine, great, that's helpful. Our new model in the UK is really helpful, but it doesn't tidy everything up. We still have other things as well. There are other options in that. Not everyone becomes that, some of them do. The second thing maybe you're arguing for is like a legal status that does try and tidy things up. So it doesn't matter what you've registered as. Is there a way that legally you can sort of get this extra status and say, I'm a social enterprise, right? And maybe I've registered as a company limited by shares and my shares are owned by blah, blah, or maybe I'm a small startup, or maybe I'm a co-op owned by a community, but I want to tidy up this sector and give it a legal status. In some countries, they've done that. It's not an incorporation form. It's an extra badge that you can legally put on. Now, great. If we could tidy it up and everyone joined, maybe that would be good. But trouble is, you can't get everyone to join, but you can try. Why are you doing that? Are you doing that because you want to attach it to a policy advantage? So as you said, if you want this, I completely agree with you, Isabel, on what I think these organizations and businesses can achieve, and government should recognize that. Is it because you want government to introduce, say, tax advantages or rules about procurement that favour these particular businesses. And actually, that's what I think in many countries people are talking about. They say, we want a legal status for social enterprise because we want government to give them a tax benefit. That assumes that government will want to give them a tax benefit. And actually in the EU, and until recently in the UK, and I think probably actually still in the UK, you're not allowed to give procurement advantages and tax benefits to certain types of organisations based on their ownership. You can't say, I'm actually going to tax these lovely social enterprises less than those organisations owned by venture capital or private equity. Or I prefer family businesses, I'm own business, I'm going to give them preferable advantages in procurement and not to these ones owned by a national chain. You're not under EU rules and probably WTO rules, I'm not sure, you're not allowed to do that. In some countries you are, right? You know, I'm sure in China, if they want to do that, they can do that, it's fine. But under certain rules, you're not. So is that what you're arguing for? A legal status? Maybe. Or is it a third thing that you're arguing for? Actually, what you really want is recognition for these guys, everyone to understand what this stuff is. And I think that is actually the biggest challenge we're up against is in the UK, we've got problems at the moment, say, with our water system. There's sewage, dirty rivers everywhere. We've got a problem with the trains are not on time. We've got problems with the huge pressure on health and social care. And the political debate is always, maybe in the US, you'd characterize it as Bernie Sanders versus Reagan. I talk about Thatcher and Corbyn. The debate, the public debate is, do you privatize or nationalize? Is it under the control of the state or the market? Is it about the business take it over or run it through the government? And it's very difficult to get into that debate and go, hold on, there might be this other thing, which is kind of using enterprise and commercialness, but with that social purpose is locked in and the profits are directed that way. And halfway through that sentence, the newsreader would go, what? I don't understand. I'm sorry, our viewers don't know what you're on about. Are you talking privatise or national? And actually, that's the thing that we're generally wrestling with most of all is explaining what it is that we're all about and communicating what this stuff is.
Super useful. And I'm going to go to Natalia. Before, I just wanted to say is the second one, Dan. And what I have in mind is BRAC. BRAC reaches 135 million people, and their secret are the social enterprises. And those social enterprises, until a few years ago, were not taxed. Why? Because they were reinvesting 50% of the profits into the enterprise, and 50% of the profits were invested for their social, education, health, justice programs. And so now they're being taxed. If there was a framework for social enterprises that had that clarity, they would be in a better place, I think. So that was
for sure. I'm also, in the UK, I'm very nervous about arguing for tax breaks for these things because, a lot of our arguments around these are organisations, businesses that make the world more equal and actually address inequality. So it's a bit weird to sort of start deploying but they should be taxed less and not contribute to government costs. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's a slightly weird argument. It's like the tension is a bit difficult, I think, to argue for tax breaks for these things that are, do you know what I mean? It's a subtle argument, I think.
Okay, Natalia.
So this is a useful debate. I'm afraid I don't have a yes or no answer, like for or against. I think there are kind of considerations for having and not having legal definitions and strict legal framework for social enterprises. So I think it's definitely a big partner in development that merits attention from the government, and that can come strategic targeting, policy frameworks and responses, legal definitions. And for me, in a way, legislation is a more, rigid tool that can backfire if not developed properly, and in a field that is very dynamic and evolving and has many gray zones and kind of permeating areas. I'm a little bit cautious, especially in developing countries with relatively weak institutional systems and lack of evidence on what works and what not, to go into kind of legal aspects. I think it's so a couple of ideas I think that different countries have. For example, the EU works around the social and solidarity economy concept and strategy that encompasses many aspects of, businesses doing good. I think it's a relatively flexible framework that allows to develop and support policies that tailored to different contexts, and the EU obviously has very varied contexts and varied definitions of social enterprises depending on the country, but still keep this, as Dan said, like the overarching recognition that this is an important partner in development. I also, the second badge, like having, I think one of the potential solution for not only, or not necessarily using the legal definition of social enterprises and writing them into a law would be the certification approach, right? And many countries also pursued that. I think Singapore has a certifying agency for social enterprises. And I think that has a benefit because it also forces you to reconsider. So once you register as a social enterprises, you are set whether you're doing the job or not. Certification is a flexible tool where you can also change the aspects, right? So and then what we've seen also in, especially in more developing countries, that social enterprises over their life cycle and lifespan change the nature of the legal registration in businesses. Those that start with NGOs can transition into private, like firms registration and so on. Some of them are cooperatives, and many of these forms just fit the needs of the social enterprise at the particular stage of development. And so again, I think it will be difficult to have a legal definition that accommodates all of these aspects. And I'll stop there, and I'm sure that Colin has other things. Thanks.
Colin.
Oh, I just very quickly wanted to reinforce something that, I mean, building on the challenge of the definition, but something that Dan said especially, I think our challenge has been, I think as a social enterprise, you know, I used to work on the African government relations team. I led all our work with African governments, now with US legislators and like USAID, with all of those stakeholders. If you are doing the work, they don't know where to bucket you, to Dan's point. You're not a company, you're not an NGO, and they're very confused by that point. And until we sort of build this conceptual understanding that there is a middle ground, that you don't have to be in either end of the buckets, you can't even start the definition question, you can't start the legal question, because they just don't know what to do with you, right? And so I don't disagree, Isabel, that like the definition is important and we ideally want those legal frameworks, but we're not going to get there until we've like widened people's imagination that there is this blended hybrid model. And just to point out, especially in agriculture, this is what infuriates me. The US or the European agriculture systems would not exist without subsidy. They wouldn't. You know, we subsidize massive portions of those economies. Yet USAID will go to Africa and they'll say, no, you need a fully like profit-making market-based solution. That's the only way to scale agriculture with farmers that are, you know, a fraction of the size. That just, the moral, that's just so wrong that we do that. But we're not, the problem is that those African governments don't have the tax base to create the same support. So you need other mechanisms to efficiently leverage the subsidy money. And I think that's where this middle ground comes in. It's like a different way of thinking about scaling until you have that tax base. And I think you just like, until you like get people to understand that you have that middle ground, you're never going to get to the more important regulatory conversations. But honestly, Natalia and Dan do more of that interesting work, so I defer to them.
Yeah. So the way to agree, I think here is it depends on where you are, and what you're saying, Colin, is that it takes a long time to get to the recognition that this is of value, and you know, sort of fixating on the legal is putting the cart before the horse, or the horse before the cart. Yes, very good. Great. Good. So I wanted to ask you, Dan, any lessons? I mean, the UK, I know that you're working globally, but your experience in the UK is really valuable. We used to think, when Natalia and I were doing capacity building for Eastern Europe, Eastern Africa, sorry, policymakers, we used to think about the UK as the sort of gold standard for social enterprises, and we understand, and then you helped us in the book on that, that those golden days are gone after Brexit. A lot of that disappeared because of the lack of political will, or political focus. What do you think, looking back though, it was a really good run if you think about all the things that were put together? What are the lessons for you if you knew what happened now? What would you have advised differently in the UK?
What a question. That's brilliant as well. I mean, I think one thing we learned, or my interpretation of what happened, is actually some of the long-term infrastructure, the enabling landscape, the ecosystem that helped social enterprise develop came down to sort of one or two little decisions by one or two people. So like we had one minister, a lady called Patricia Hewitt, who was a minister in the Department for Business and then the Department for Health, and she set up a team in each of those departments, and that team then, you know, they had staff, they had a budget, they created things like the community interest company legislation, they created certain funds, they even created, to some extent, they helped create Social Enterprise UK sort of in its early forms. Unlimited, our foundation for social entrepreneurs, was created on it. So actually that kind of political sponsorship from one or two key people that really get it, and that they put in place structures that then last. You know, they don't just have, oh, we've got a social enterprise program this year, and then they put in place sort of funds, structures, teams, legislation. That, I think, that's lasted us. You know, actually we're still doing okay 15 years after some of that stuff was great, even though nothing's really happened for 10 years, because those structures were quite lasting things that so I think that was a good thing, a positive thing. I mean, personally, I think some of the mistakes we made and the things that I would have advised against, maybe in the last 10 years under the Conservative government, but is people getting too excited about certain ideas that are sexy and trendy and fashionable. So you've got things like social impact bonds that you might call outcome-based payments. You've got things like, we have this idea for a thing called a social stock exchange, right? So if you've got social enterprise, if you've got enterprise, you've got social enterprise. Oh, so let's have a social stock exchange, social investment, social. Just because you can stick the word social before it doesn't mean that it makes sense as an idea. So our social stock exchange idea in the UK was a disaster. Now it's sort of worked to some extent in other places, but ours was an absolute scandal and a disaster. Social impact bonds, I'm not saying that they're bad or problematic, but the noise and the hype and the excitement about them was completely disproportionate to their relevance and usefulness to most societies. So I you know, maybe it's just me being grumpy and getting older, and you know, to the whole sort of language of the fetishization of innovation, of a new idea, of a exciting, trendy new thing. It means that we spent a lot of time and resource kind of chasing, you know, something that sounded great, but actually maybe we should have just done some more boring policy quietly, you know, and politicians can't do that, right? They get excited about the next thing. So it's, you know, it's difficult, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think, I mean, thinking about Larry's is actually here. I can see him on the chat of Larry's framework, where he talks about 3 ways to scale: replication, growth, replication, and collaboration. And the collaboration means building a movement. And I think there's some sort of a movement behind social enterprises in the UK that I guess maybe helped what you said. The continuity that happened in spite of no political focus. But I also think in the scaling up community of practice, we talk a lot about the fact that the innovation is not just that sexy idea, but it's the innovation of the whole process of implementing something and making things happen, including shifting when things don't quite work well. And maybe that is a way of thinking about innovation that can be really helpful. Natalia, do you want to come in on this topic, or Colin?
I was monitoring the questions in the chat, and Johannes, that we worked together quite a lot. I think it's a very interesting question that you are asking, your question too, on you know, if there is a public good externality argument, then outcome-oriented incentives can be justified for any enterprise. It doesn't need to be social. And I think that comes to the heart of kind of my fundamental principle as a development economist, is that we need development outcome for the people that, you know, for our beneficiaries. Who deliver them, if they're well delivered on time, to be honest, is immaterial. But for me, social enterprises fill a very important gap between the private sector and the government, and as such, they're important partners. But I think for me, it's not the social enterprise field. For me, it's like one of the important tools and actors in development. I think going after developing social enterprise field just for the sake of it, it's not my commitment. My commitment is to make sure that they are, integrated in a productive way. And if the private sector does this job in a better way and cheaper, faster, great. Let the markets take over, right? So I don't particularly have. I think that's my hesitation for definitions. Also, that's where it's coming from, because I think the eye is on the development, and then everything comes from.
Very good. So I see, Colin, that you're active in the chat. Maybe you could share it with us, and I also see your hand up, and then I'm going to move to Nancy McPherson's question in the chat. Yeah.
Just very, very, I mean, I think my chat comment is about registration, which I could take offline, but just very quickly on this point, and I totally agree with Natalia, like this is another problem with getting lost in the definition is like, what is the goal here? And I think the goal is like creating sustainable, scalable impact, right? I mean, that's why we are a part of this community of practice. And I think, again, back to just getting lost in the model, I think an outcome-based approach that's open to any enterprise, right, but that actually can rigorously prove impact is our goal. And I think the social enterprise just offers in some sense, just recognizes, especially when you're an organization like ours that serves bottom of the pyramid, customers. I mean, look, let's be honest, like for-profit companies that are serving smallholder farmers, like there's no guarantee that they're any more sustainable. It's really hard to make money, and you think about like, the kwacha in Malawi devalued by like 40% overnight, a couple months ago, right? Like that's going to put a company out of business. So I think like, it's not like you're for profit and now you're magically sustainable. No, like if you're serving bottom of the pyramid, the reality is like it's going to be hard to do it if you're not leveraging some sort of blended tools. And I think, and Larry, I know we've debated this in our early days of me joining the community of practice, but I just don't believe in this binary between you either scale through companies or you scale through the government. Like I just think we have to accept this messy middle. There are trillions of dollars in the world that can be leveraged in innovative ways through innovative financing, outcome-based approaches. And I don't think we only have to think about profit and taxes as the two ways we scale. I just think there's just a much more robust middle ground, and that goes beyond the social enterprise point, because any sort of enterprise can leverage that.
Yeah, great. And I'm going to now move to you, Colin, for your presentation. But before that, I just want to answer Nancy McPherson's question. Choosing the right outcome is key. How do you understand system dynamics? Do you use system mapping tools? And so on my side, we do start with system dynamics, system mapping for anything that we do on scaling. But I don't know if any Dan or Natalia or Colin want to come in on that, or whether we move to Colin's presentation. Yeah, I think not understanding the system is a big mistake. Yes, so over to you, Colin. You're going to tell us about a case study, how to build support for agriculture social enterprises with US policymakers.
Yeah, and I'd say it's less a case study and more a story. It's very informal and it'll be very quick, but I just want to sort of tell everyone the story of like my attempt to explain social enterprises to US congressional staff over the last couple of years. So I think firstly, Isabel briefly introduced One Acre Fund. So we're a social enterprise that works with about 4 million farmers across Africa. We're definitely on more the mission side of the social enterprise. We get about 75% of our costs from farmer revenue, but farmers pay market price. But again, we're serving, half acre, less than $1 a day farmers in Burundi. So when you think about all the back end support, research and development costs, like there's just some, there's some degree of subsidy that it's going to be hard for us to overcome. In a market like Kenya, we get close to cost recovery in some places, but the goal is certainly getting to 100%, but it's tough with the farmers we serve. So I think one point to make, and I've alluded to this, so I've been with One Acre Fund about 10 years. Half that time I ran our government relations team. And actually, I started thinking about this because of basically governments were trying to shut down our programs. And I was responsible for defending them, my team was. And that just got me thinking about this like lack of understanding of this model, because like most of the reason that was happening is they just didn't understand what we were, right? We were an NGO in their mind, but we were charging farmers. So literally I had a Burundian government official ask me if we were just spending money to send people to Zanzibar, right? Like just like not an understanding that there was a value in this hybrid approach. So we figured that out largely just because we had enough staff to like improve communication. But you know, when I came to DC and I shifted into this global policy role, one of the things I wanted to do was figure out how to address that similar problem with US policymakers. And putting USAID aside, like that's a whole separate conversation, how I've talked about social enterprises with USAID. I was really interested in doing this on Capitol Hill with Congress. So that was the introduction to the swamp. As many of you know, we lovingly, those of us that live in DC, lovingly call DC the swamp. This building is the embodiment of that. And so, you know, we started with just doing lots of meetings. Like we just wanted to I wanted to introduce our model to lots of staffers on Capitol Hill. And I think it was really interesting. Like they were interested in what we were doing. But I think what we found is it was particularly effective when we could bring people from the field. And so this is Yash, who's our country director from Malawi, is just an example of we got the most traction when we brought people from the field and sort of really could explain why this hybrid model was important. And that actually led us to finding a really important champion who just really believed in our program and actually really did understand what a social enterprise was, that middle ground. And because of that, we got really close with his chief of staff, and that really led to some, you know, our first big win, which was getting in a report, in a congressional report, a suggestion to USAID to work more at social enterprises in agriculture. So not a huge deal, but it was the first time social enterprises was mentioned in an appropriations report. So yay, we were all very excited. Now, it ended up not doing much, and I'm going to talk about that afterwards. But the bigger point to make is that big champion was indicted. Welcome to the swamp. He left Congress. We had to start over again. So there we go. There's one lesson of doing this work. So we entered Act 2, which was, we started thinking that report language really didn't do anything. Like it literally, like for a couple years, we tried to like talk to people about it, but nobody cared. So we thought, okay, how do we start doing the most Washington, DC of things, getting an earmark, getting money earmarked for social enterprises? So that's through what was called the appropriations process. So we started a whole, because we lost our other champion. He was in jail. Actually, I don't know where he is. I'm assuming jail. So we started a whole new process of finding new champions. And so a lot of that was just much more leaning into like the scale, the sustainability of like what social enterprises could do, but sort of, you know, still really focusing on the term social enterprise. And we got another win. We got actual money appropriated for social enterprises in a bill, in an appropriations bill. Yay, right? We can all like declare victory, except no, it was totally stalled out. Like the next year it was taken out. The person that got it in got distracted. And I think one of the lessons was like USAID gets 1 million of these requests. And it's, to be fair to USAID, it's like, it's actually not super helpful to add another earmark to USAID. It's actually a problem that there's too many earmarks from Congress. And so I think we realized that in some sense we were just contributing to that problem, and there wasn't much they could do. It wasn't a lot of money. And it was just hard to keep in the bill. And so, you know, so that kind of like made us think, well, maybe this appropriations path isn't actually the best path. And also because it forced us to stay focused on that term social enterprise, which was one reason it stalled out, was I just think like what it meant that they had to give X number of dollars to social enterprises, there just wasn't enough clarity to that. So that started the third act, which is the final act. Don't worry, there's no more acts. Which is thinking more about what's called authorizing language. So there's two basic processes in the US Congress: appropriations to get the money, right? And then authorizing, where you create new programs, right? And our thinking here was, what's great about if you can get something authorized, it's there forever. It lasts past administrations, right? It's better than getting a policy at USAID, because, you know, USAID policy can change through administration. So it's a way of creating more permanent change. So we changed tack to focus on, could we find an authorizing piece of legislation that also was less focused on the term social enterprise and more focused, like I said before, on like the goals we really care about. And the second really important bit is like working more with coalitions. And here's just the list. Not everyone on this group, I mean, I work with all these coalitions, various degrees. Not all of them are fully aligned with everything I do. But I think a thing I learned is just we're a very small fish in a massive ocean. So just thinking about how to leverage collaboration more was another really key lesson in this third act. And there's actually there's two particular opportunities we're excited about. So one is it's a bill called the Fostering Innovation and Global Development Act. It's in the House, Representatives Castro and Kim, so bipartisan. And that's really about how you better leverage innovation, but most excitedly, how you scale innovation. And so to create a new, like this new proven solutions focus at USAID, we actually got a definition of scale that Larry and Johannes helped contribute to. I don't know if you remember that. It was like a random email from me. But the idea is that social enterprise is in this bill. Like I did get the term in the bill, but more importantly, there's an approach to scale that I think social enterprises, if this were created, would be well placed to be successful in. So it would be an interesting new opportunity for social enterprises. And then the second is a Senate bill from Senators Graham, Coons, and Bozeman, so also bipartisan. This is much more recent. It would create a new food security foundation, so an independent 501c3 that would be co-funded from the private sector and government. It would very much be about a different market-based solutions to agriculture. And I've been able to work with staff on that and get a lot of language in around sort of an outcome-based approach, a portfolio approach to development, a very impact-focused approach. We don't have to get in the weeds, but it's a lot of things that ultimately, again, I think the social enterprise sector would be an interesting partner with this foundation. So the idea being that social enterprise is mentioned nowhere in this bill or like outside of one place, but I think it could be a really interesting tool. So I've sort of then made this pivot to these authorizing pieces of legislation. Both are ongoing, like lots of work to be done. If anyone's interested in collaborating, please reach out to me. These are very live opportunities. But I think the key point is I think we have found a much better approach thanks to like all these steps. And fingers crossed, no one else we work with gets indicted. But I think we're in a better place. So what are the lessons we've learned? What we were talking about earlier, not getting lost in the definition. Again, Isabel, not to say the definition isn't important, but I think, you have to sort of build an idea of what we're talking about first. And so breaking down the component parts of what we care about, I think has helped with some of these other pieces of legislation. The mechanism matters, right? Thinking more about these long-term authorizing mechanisms has really helped. And then just this point again, like you have to work with coalitions if you do this to do this effectively. So how do you bring coalitions along with you, many of whom have no idea what a social enterprise is? So you have to sort of like, explain why this matters to development. So there you go. That's my story. It's ongoing.
Thank you so much. Colin, there's a question from Larry on the chat. If one were opting for hybrid solutions at scale, does the concessionary portion of the funding at scale need to depend on foundations and official funders in the short and medium term? If so, wouldn't that require massive increases in those allocations?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I would say, so foundations and what was the other, is it in the chat? Let me just read it.
Yeah. And official funders.
What do you mean by official funder?
Bilaterals, I guess.
Oh, bilaterals. I think I think one question is how that money is being spent, right? So, one of the biggest challenges that we face is, so we get a lot of, our scaling money has come a lot from high net worth individuals, right? Who basically, we create a very rigorous impact number, and they basically trust our impact number and they trust how we're making decisions around it. And they basically fund us to meet that outcome. So, effectively an outcome-based, financing mechanism. And that's allowed us to get unrestricted money. And I think that's the key point, that there's a lot of money that comes from these bilateral donors and even with foundations, but it tends to be very activity restricted. And that doesn't work for social enterprises. So I would argue, Larry, the issue is not the amount of money out there, it's how the money is spent. And the money is all being spent on these like short-term activities that are limited by whatever log frame you created 5 years ago. So I think it's more about
So-
like, and that's what I'm trying to do in these pieces of legislation is offer up different mechanisms.
So thinking about scaling, taking it back to the scaling community of practice. So clearly you made the sort of the trip from doing it on your own, lobbying, and then to realizing the collaboration party was essential, and that's very consistent with the way that we think of the community of practice. My question is, and I don't have it clear now, what does it unlock for you in terms of
Well,
potential for scale? What does it unlock? Does it unlock more financing for social enterprises in USAID projects? I didn't understand.
Yeah, I would say this is much less important for One Acre Fund than the social enterprise sector because, we have we have a robust existing, financing path through what I just described. But I would say that, if I think just purely from the agriculture space, from like the smallholder agriculture space, what One Acre Fund I hope proves is that if you get the financing right, it's not rocket science to dramatically increase smallholder yields. This is actually pretty straightforward to solve those market failings if you get the financing. And there are other social enterprises like One Acre Fund, Myagro, Accesso, that basically haven't been able to convince a bunch of billionaires to give them money. It's just hard to do. So I think that in a world where we move some of that public money to funding the growth. Again, I'm just thinking agriculture, like there's probably a broader point around other social enterprises, but that's the perspective I have. Hunger rates are going up around the world. Climate change is making it worse. I actually think that lever point is just underutilized. And if we came up with a different approach to financing that focused more on this sort of like what works for a social enterprise, I don't see why a dozen more social enterprises couldn't scale to the extent that we have. It's just like, I don't think it's impossible.
Yeah, very good. Great, good. So we're almost out of time. So I just wanted to close by asking both Natalia and Dan if they have any reactions or any closing comments before we go. I don't see any more questions on the chat. So Natalia, should we start with you?
No, my words are just words of thanks, especially for Colin. I think this is a very, very inspiring story. I think it's impressive you're managing to do it as an individual social entrepreneur and as part of your organization without like major supportive development programs. We sometimes go and do it in the countries we're pushing, but there is a big machinery and institution behind. And so congratulations, really, really inspiring. And
I haven't
thank you,
achieved
Isabel
much, so no.
Well, Isabel, thank you so much. Really appreciate the discussion. And
thank you, Natalia, for coming. Great, good. Dan?
Yeah, just a couple of little things. I just echo Colin's points about building alliances, trying to build sort of structures that last rather than short-term policies. Not always just focusing on social enterprises. Yeah, we at SUK we had quite a really positive influence on some legislation around procurement, the use of government spending. We weren't saying spend it more on social enterprises, but it helps social enterprises, and it also encourages all businesses to raise their kind of game in terms of social and environmental terms. So yeah, I just agree with a lot of what he said about approaches to lobbying and advocacy. Other little things I just mentioned, there's been quite a lot of talk about scale, and I just also add actually some of our successes in the UK and I think around the world are built on replication. So actually you probably have this where you live. There's things like bike workshops or wood recycling projects, and we've got those in sort of every town in the UK now. We don't need one big wood recycling project, but we do need a wood recycling project in every town, and that's wonderful and that's great. So sometimes that replication is one way to scale the impact. And I think also in every country we've worked, we've always kind of come across older models that have always been there that people really value, but they don't call them social enterprise in big letters. Yeah. And that might be, village lending models. It might be in sort of, say, what they call IDEA and ECUB in Ethiopia or things like that in other African countries. The NHS in the UK, our national health system, was built on sort of mutual self-help cooperative models in the Welsh Valleys.
Oh, wow.
So that was sort of social enterprise that led to the NHS that we're so proud of. I think there's kind of water management models in Kyrgyzstan and herding sort of mutual models in Mongolia. So we all know really that there are ways of organizing economic activity based on principles of sort of mutual respect, of sharing the proceeds, of equal power. Yeah. So, you know, even when it feels sometimes a bit hopeless if no one understands this other space, there are sometimes other ways that we can get that message across, that we haven't just made something up in the last 3 years. There is a strong history here of humans helping each other to thrive economically in slightly fairer ways than some of the more recent decades versions of capitalism. You know,
Absolutely. Great, good. I think there are many solutions to the problems that we face, and replication is one of the ways to actually change the world, and we shouldn't underappreciate what it brings. And I leave for you, Colin, to close. I really admire your force of nature, taking on the U.S. Legislative is quite something. I admire you for it. And over to you to close the session, Colin.
Well, I mean, it's not just me. I mean, there's, you know, a lot of support. So I mean, that's the coalition point. And my force of nature really annoys my wife. So I'm going to let her know that, like, you know, it's not only a bad, annoying thing. But yeah, thank you. It's been I'm really glad we had this session. Larry, Johannes, just thank you so much for sticking with the Social Enterprise Working Group. I know, Isabel, I think as the year progresses, I hope we can do much more as a working group. I know we've all been very busy, but just to sort of let everyone know that we do want to, like, reanimate this group in the coming year and just do more within the community of practice. It's just hard as we're all trying to balance our day jobs. But I think this is a really important thing. And Natalia, Dan, thank you so much for joining. I learned so much from you, and hopefully you can join future calls. I do think, to your point, Isabel, this is a very important underutilized development tool, domestically, internationally, and maybe the last point to make on that, Larry, something that you said at a speech I heard you give years ago is we have to, like, rethink the model of development where it's the global North and the global South, right? Like, we're talking about challenges that are as relevant in Pittsburgh as Nairobi, and I think what I love about social enterprises is it's something the world is trying to figure out. It's not about development. This is something we're all trying to figure out. And Dan, I think having your UK perspective was great. So, like, I hope we can keep it as a core part of the community of practice.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and goodbye, everybody. Thank you.